What is going on, everyone? We are here for episode number 2 of the Literary Renaissance podcast with the man himself, Benno Archimbaldi, the man, the myth, the legend from Stranger Strands over on Substack. Benno, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this episode, and I'm really excited to talk with you.
Yeah, Benno, everyone, is an absolute killer. Benno was a part of my book club and still is a part of my book club, and he would be blowing my mind. We would read these books, and like he would just be shattering me and be like, "Oh my god, did we read the same book? Jesus Christ!" And I would like come in with some optimistic point of view, and Benno would be like, "Wait, no." And so I was like, "Wow, who the hell is this guy?" And then he started releasing his writing even before we started the writing school, and I was like, "Oh my god!" Like Benno's writing is like I'm sometimes I've been at work before and he's like sent something off on Substack and I'm like, oh my God, and I have to go put headphones in while I'm working, maybe, which isn't a good idea. And like sit down and like relax and be like, I have to read this slowly. Like there's some things that Benno does. So anyway, everyone, we'll talk about your writing, of course, throughout this podcast, but everyone, first and foremost, go to the link down in the description below. Go check out some of Benno's writings. He is one of the killers out there right now. Like when I say literary renaissance, I think of Benno. I am a paid subscriber to some of it, to his Substack. And so we'll stop gassing you up for a second. But speaking of your writing, Benno, if you go to your Substack right now, one of the first things you're going to see pinned at the top of your page is your winter haiku collection. And you wrote 2 posts about haikus, kind of breaking some of the mythos about like the 575 and all that. Can you just kind of speak, briefly or not so briefly about what we have wrong about haikus in the West and what haikus really are?
Yeah, absolutely. Like haiku is like a very interesting kind of poem because, like, even though it's become like basically universally known and it's very popular, the way it's being kind of adapted in the rest of the world has been like in a very shallow kind of way. And I'm not here to really like gatekeep what haiku is or not, that's not the point. It's more about really helping people to go deeper into this very rich tradition, right? And I think because haiku, it's such a, like, at least in this metric scheme of the 575 metric count, because it's so simple, it has been kind of like adopted to teach poetry, whether it's in like primary education or otherwise. So it has become like this kind of like educational tool. So that's made it, like, to be taught in in lots of schools, and but people grow up thinking that's just it, right? Like just like a 575 metric scheme. And that's maybe one of the least important aspects of it. There's like, even in classical haiku, Basho, who was like the founder, he wrote himself like haikus who that didn't fit that like metric shape, and generally accepted, like other rhyming schemes. And and, and it's just this lack of really understanding what the haiku rules serve towards, which is writing like a poem, right? It's not just following rules to play almost like this little word game. It All these rules serve like a certain purpose. And for example, the metric scheme of 575 is something that adapts towards the Japanese language, right? Because Japanese language has its own like a metric, like preference, I guess, because of how it's structured. And it's so it doesn't make sense to try to adapt it to another language, like, for example, English, which might sound really different, right? It would be like forcing them to write sonnets in iambic pentameter. It would just sound horrible in Japanese. It wouldn't really make sense. So it's a lot about just recognizing what these rules actually work towards, and not just following them blindly to do like a word game, I guess.
Yeah, because I know you've written some ghazals, and like I was researching into that, and in actuality, in Arabic or whatever, it classically they're 2 lines, but in English, if you actually translate it, it's more likely to be 3 lines. Same with haiku. So with these languages and these metric rules, like it doesn't really translate as well. Especially with different alphabets and like different systems of like, it's not like bringing a romance language to English or something like that. It's just totally different. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, and it's also about, why I like haiku too. It's also about the spirit, man. There's something internal about that. There's something beautiful about Basho. Like a lot of his poems are only recovered. They were leaving them on bark. Like that would have been a tradition for over 1,000 years with poetry. You throw one on the road for, here's a poem for the road. Like, I think that there needs to be a little bit more of that. Like, obviously you and I are on Substack and we do performative, or we post something out to the world, but I know you. I mean, you and I have written hundreds of poems that will never see the light of day, if not thousands, and random things, and sometimes just random scribbles. And that's something that's what writing at some level is really about. I talk about transformation, literary renaissance all the time, but at some level, you can't do that unless you're just in the flow and experiencing it all the time. So, yeah.
Yes, and this is something that it's also very special about the haiku tradition. At least, like from the origins, like it was very connected to a spirituality, and it was, and like people almost became disciples of Basho. He was seen like almost like this spiritual leader, and it was almost like an alternative to like Shinto, or to like Zen. It was just like a way of really developing spiritually. And I think that's something that I try to look for in poetry and try to bring in my work, that to reconnect with this aspect of poetry that serves almost as a bridge towards the spiritual, towards the more higher dimensions of life, right? It's not just necessarily about woe is me or love poems, like, which is something that it's almost like, um, yeah, degenerated into right now. Like when you, but like, but like haiku really has this very a spiritual direction, that I think it's important to understand and recognize and value, because that's what will give a lot of strength back to poetry, I guess, in at least in the West, right?
100%. I mean, it's so bad too that sometimes I'm showing poetry to people, even people that we know, and things that are there's like poetry is just so messed up because the people's perceptions of what good poetry is has been so messed up that if you write something that is more spiritual or less ambitious or whatever, then it's perceived like, the other day someone was like, is this supposed to be good? And I was like, oh, what do I say to this? Like, and like, so yeah, and yeah, anyway. So I wanted to ask you this for a second. How did you come to this? Because you've been at this for a long time. How did you come to focus on this kind of perception towards poetry? Like, were there influences, or you were just like, you know what? I'm not petty. I'm better. I'm better than this. Like, I don't need to sit here and do confessional poems. Like, how did you get oriented toward this?
Well, I've always been very interested in like literature and art in general. So like that's always been like something I've worked in forever, I guess. But like poetry is more interesting because it's uh, yeah, because of its place in culture. I didn't really get into it until almost like I found by accident certain writers, I guess. Like for me, at least, the first one that it started opening that kind of dimension was William Burroughs, because his use of language in a lot of ways is very poetical, and it just started making me realize by using this kind of like techniques, if you want to call it just that, like you could access like just like deeper ways of understanding and revealing like things that are way more subtle. And from then on, I just like started doing experiments, and like also T.S. Eliot was also very influential, right? Like that, he was also very important, I guess. I found like by accident like the Wasteland, and his other poems, and like just like the first lines of like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That was just again very impactful in terms of of what it reveals to you about the language, right? Like I think um, most of what is special about poetry is that because it works upon using language in extraordinary ways, the effect is really can be very impactful, right? Because we're all the time kind of like using language where whether we are like thinking about things or communicating, but we use it in a very narrow way because that's what is required to like convey information in an effective way. But like poetry kind of like uses that and turns and like reveals that it can be used towards um, way more subtle and spiritual and transcendental aspects, and makes it like a really powerful revelation, right? Like to start using language towards um, higher purposes, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned The Wasteland because now that you say that, I could totally see its influence on your work. That's actually funny because I sometimes I wonder, like, where I understand a lot of it's you and it's your own experimentations. I was like, where is this orienting from? So that's why I was asking that. Can you speak, and I think it's interesting that The Wasteland is really a interesting poem because it's the perfect almost mix of the old world, the Victorian classical forms of poetry, because Eliot was of that world. He was, raised in that. But also the future. And I've heard before that like many poets in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s were like, we don't know what to do with this thing because it's just so bizarre to us. And they were obviously trying to be more progressive and shoot off into postmodernism and into new heights. But then I've always thought, like looking at Eliot and others, like when we talk about the Renaissance, right? The original Renaissance looked back at the Greeks, and I think for us at some level, looking back to the Victorian era and a lot of the poetry from like 1300 to 1800 is pretty much a dead zone. A lot of it's like some of it's good, obviously, but a lot of it's just kind of like forced by Christianity, and they were in these constraints. So, I have a feeling that like modernism and that stuff is really going to be like our launching off point. That like obviously postmodernism build off modernism, but that like going back to that and like speaking of the haiku, like they were the ones that brought that into the West. And could you speak a little bit more about T.S. Eliot and just the Wasteland and that? I mean, if you have anything.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like what made T.S. Eliot really good was part of it is like this sense of tradition, right?
Mm.
Like part of what made like it started corrupting a lot of art, I guess, in the past century was this tendency to want to break all the rules and break away from tradition, and this obsession with originality, and just like generally it became almost like a competition of wit, like and very centered around almost like intelligence and these like egoic uh, presentations, right? And T.S. Eliot had like a what would have been like considered more like the classical education in poetry, right? Like studying Greek, studying Latin, studying like the mythology, and he was able to use that in a way that he brought new life to it. And even though it still had this intellectual bent in a lot of ways, it was still also very concerned with reconnecting with the spiritual aspect. The Wasteland, in a sense, is just this the struggle to reconnect with the spirituality from this like from the, I guess, the wasteland that the intellectualism of of the West and this breaking off with traditions and led towards.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that too, that, and Elliot's just a weird figure, that he was raised in, like, Missouri and, like, was had this base out in nature and was a fan of Mark Twain and all these guys, reader. But, it was a different time. Like you had to be steeped in tradition. Like they were actually teaching poetry in school and like you were expected to do good. Like with my students, if someone writes a poem and they do their best effort and it's a bunch of shit, I can't give them an F or I'm going to get fired. But back in the day, creative writing programs, if you turned in something shitty, like they gave you an F. Like they were actually standards. Like you actually had to like show up and like do something. That's a whole other story. But it's interesting because that's like sports. Like, when we throw kids into sports, like in public education, some of them are gonna rise to the top. I've known plenty of kids who just start a random sport their freshman year they've never played before, and suddenly they're really good at it. And so like we've like we're not putting people in mass in numbers anymore into a lot of the arts, which is sad because there's always these untapped people. But yeah, but interestingly enough, I find, you know, Eliot like rose up, and what really broke him out of rationality was like the symbolists like Rimbaud and some of the Spanish thinkers. And yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, he's a really interesting mix because he was also a banker. So he's got this spiritual side, but then he's like this nice British man. And like, it's a really you know, yeah, and that's something else that's like sad that we've also lost, that like we're in the wanderlust era right now and everyone goes to Bali and all this stuff. But like, like the expatriates of the United States, especially in modernism, that's the only reason modernism got big, is we had all these Americans who were raised in these crazy places like Idaho, with Pound and Illinois, like Hemingway, and then they all moved to Europe and had this renaissance themselves. So, that's a whole other thing. So
Yeah, yeah, it's like and also they had like more of a sense of community, and like there would have been like the hotspots of like artistic creation, which was something that was also very um common, I guess. Like almost every like big important artistic movement had like almost like a hotspot where all the artists would like even travel towards to work, right? Like, and now because we become like obsessed with more like the individual way of working, I guess, or the conception of the artist. We no longer search for this sort of like communal effort, like, and this cross pollination between different artists, like with yeah, like which would have been like between painters, musicians, and writers, and everybody just got together, and like that made it like a very fertile environment to work in, and now we are even like suspicious, right, like of working with other people, like it's just very tense because it's almost like a competition, right? Like so yeah, that's another aspect that I think is really lacking today.
yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up, Benno, because one of the things that you've been doing over on Substack that's blown my mind is these collaboration pieces, which I was like, oh my God, like, someone would do the soundscape and write the poem, and then you would do the reading in your low voice, and then someone would put a painting, like some really good projects over there. I'll link some of those down in the description below. Can you tell people, how did that come about? How do you make a a 3-person poetry collaboration happen? Like, because it's just guys, like if you go watch some of these, like it's wonderful. It's like wow. And like that Benno and Josh, they've been like, they blew my mind. Like wow, there really needs to be an audio component to poetry. Not every poem, but it needs to be there sometimes, and it's sad when it's not there.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is just from this desire, first of all, to to bring more community, more a sense of collaboration and working together, because that's an element that, as I mentioned, like sometimes can trigger a lot of development personally. So for me, it was just like a matter um, of like also recognizing like the value in somebody else's work and seeing how it can be made to stand out in a way where other people might be able to recognize that too. So like and seeing how, and like it was really cool to see how, by for example, working on somebody else's poem and not in like a personal idea, like just like learning to adapt, I guess, towards somebody else aesthetics also becomes very um, rich in terms of creativity, right? So like uh, I, it's been really wonderful to see like in these collaborations how like different talents that the person might have not realized they had, like just from this like collaboration, like come out to the surface, right? So I think that's been like very cool and very rewarding.
Yeah, and it's so funny about the writing community, and sometimes I push this too hard. I mean, I try not to. Is that we've with a lot of writers have taken a very objective point of view with how they are viewing their work. They're trying to optimize their minutes on the page and get this done and all this stuff, and it's very linear. But if you've ever looked at your personal life, like most breakthroughs don't happen in that. I mean, you do need to have objective standards and like work and like have a base system so you're not just some lazy person who calls himself a writer. But subjective breakthroughs are super important, and like you were just saying, that when you get outside of yourself and are like looking at someone else's poem or like doing some form of collaboration, it gets us out of this lonely sphere as writers. Because if you look once again at history, almost everyone, you can name anyone, at one point in their life they were in a deep collaboration. And sometimes, I mean, and whether it went positively or negatively, like in Nietzsche's case with Wagner, Dostoevsky at the start of his life was with all the intellectuals in Russia, and that drove him to getting sent to a prison camp. Like it does, if even if it goes bad, it goes really well a lot of the time. And so, I mean, very rarely though, I mean, there are obviously outliers, people in total isolation become great. And the ones that do aren't the type of people do you really want to be Proust? Do you really want to be Kafka? Do you really want to be Emily Dickinson? Yeah, it'd be great to write like them, but do you want to live their life? Like, sounds pretty miserable to me. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, and and that's something that we're totally missing as a community. And I think people just overrate it because a lot of these works were built with other people. I mean, and editing and proofreaders and husbands, wives, so many. I mean, there's so much that goes into great writing that people don't realize. And that's going to tee me up to my next question. It's funny, we were talking about American artists from rural America, and I want to get your opinion on this. We haven't talked about this, but David Lynch, raised in Boise, Idaho, became an Eagle Scout out there. Kind of an odd upbringing for someone who's more notorious for being a Los Angeles city type filmmaker. I mean, Twin Peaks, The Straight Story. They're technically nature based more. But I was gonna, I wanted to ask where, to open up the David Lynch can of worms. How do you think him being raised in Idaho, I which back then was the middle of nowhere, still kind of is, how did that influence his work later on? Because I don't think that ever is really talked about very much.
That's a hard question because I'm not necessarily like that knowledgeable, I guess, of that time
I
of
don't think
his
anyone
life.
is. I mean, he
So
was just living in suburban America, just doing nothing,
mm,
just riding the bike, doing Boy Scouts. Like,
yeah, yeah, like I can guess, like of from his work, there is definitely a sense of connection to nature. But again, like what makes it's special for me is that it's not necessarily from this just like ecological point of view, which is what most people would consider, which is for me also like still tied towards like a very materialistic way of viewing things, right? Like we have to protect nature because otherwise the world will end and life will end. Like it's more of a kind of pragmatical approach to it. And in his work, I think it's tied more with like a spirituality and the metaphysical dimension, that by really meditating and accessing nature, you're able to develop. And like obviously, Twin Peaks might be like the most like kind of idyllic portrayal of nature in his works, but but it seems like it's also something that he he develops in many different ways, through his symbols, I guess, like even the log lady and this sort of like more kind of animistic things he sometimes portrays, like the creepy branches in like the third season of Twin Peaks and stuff like that, that it really connects towards that more animistic almost aspect of nature.
Yeah, 100%. And it's, and I ask because it is a hard question because a lot of the nature themes are very muted. Like, we have the owls are not what they seem and log lady and like all this random stuff. But yeah, it's not like he is an ecological director by any sense. Yeah, I just wanted to ask that to you because I've just been turning on that. I was like, did this base out there, was it like the perfect pairing with then just going full on into Philadelphia and the arts and all of that and becoming the guy that wears a suit and just is chain smoking all day? Like, it's like where did that originally, or is it just pure talent? I don't know. Um, what's your what's the most underrated David Lynch movie in your opinion, Benno?
Hmm. I don't. I'm not sure because I think he's generally pretty well appreciated. Like
Not to give
perhaps,
you the easiest question, not to give you like not the most surface level questions ever, but
yeah. I mean, probably Dune. I guess I think it has like a bad reputation, but I think you know it's okay, especially in comparison again with like the new ones like the Denis Villeneuve. I think he still kind of captured also that more religious dimension of Dune, and which I don't think Denis Villeneuve has done a good job at. So yeah, probably it would have to be Dune. I guess it's the only one that is kind of looked down upon.
well, let's talk about that. I'd actually love to talk about that because what's so funny, I was like waiting in anticipation in the second movie for the water of life scene. I was like, wow. Because I remember the water of life scene in Dune 1984. Cheesy, kind of a cheesy compilation of images and the worm. Ah, the worm. Like stuff like that. A little bit, but I thought it was spiritual. I thought it was a good representation of the psychedelic experience, very hard to portray, especially back then where we've seen a lot more, fever dream type movies since then, but still pretty good. And then that was almost totally muted in this last one. Like we basically got nothing. There was no revelation. There was no like awakening. And it's like, why did that get left out? And Lynch took the risk on toddler, conscious toddler too. Like, there's so many different things that like are potent symbols that just were totally left out. And like, and I applaud Lynch for at least trying it. Like, obviously you didn't have time, but I mean, there, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's what's funny about, I mean, why did you not like these? I don't know if you didn't like them, but what were your main gripes with the recent movies?
I thought they were okay. It's not like I think they're bad. It's just that, like for me at least, Dune from like the book, like it's mostly like almost like this messiah story, and it's very concerned with like the spiritual aspects, and I think that's what makes it like an important book in terms of like sci-fi, in terms of like it's not just, which is like the problem I guess for me with the new movies. It just cares kind of like about the sci-fi aspects, and if it can, and if we'll just like erase the rest of the stuff as if it was just like a like, yeah, like not really central to the story, which is like to me a mistake, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the religious aspect, the religious programming, it was basically all just stripped away in these last two movies. And and that's one of the disasters of making Zendaya, become the rebel female, is that they were worshiping that dude. Like they were down for the cause. They were down to go kill billions of people for Mujahideen. Like it's insane. And that setup, that belief sets up, what happens in the later books, the downfall. You know what I mean? Like without pure belief, you can't get like the revelations from everything. Then you can't get what happens in book 4, like, not to spoil anything for anybody, but you know what I mean? Like it's a whole thing that like it's meant to, and that's probably because they're not seeing this series as like a long-term focus. They're not trying to get to book 4. They're not, this is the last movie coming up.
Yeah, yeah, probably. But likely, even if they were I don't think they would risk like these more crazy aspects, these more like esoterical aspects of the book. Like it's at that level of budget, it's something that it's almost impossible to. Well, maybe not. Like some things are kind of crazy right now in terms of like esoteric content, which is like why I find funny that this contrast, like between like I guess the big budgets like this and stuff like Nosferatu, which recently came out, and it was still like a big success, and it's pretty esoteric, pretty occultist. So there's like a weird like change going on right now where a lot of more occultist things are starting to pop up in like popular media. So yeah, there's like a transition going on probably.
Yeah, and, it's a very subtle transition too, because if you think back to the early 2000s when we were younger, it was like it almost always felt very cheesy, like Marilyn Manson or like classic horror movies, and they'd put the pentagram on the wall, and it'd be like, okay. But now it's actually getting like if you understand, like they're like putting encryptions and like actually adding some depth, which when you look at media, when you look at art, allowing the pagan spirit, and symbols to unleash themselves it's going to get crazy. I know you made a video on Nosferatu, on your Substack on YouTube. I'll link to that down below. Could you give us kind of your general thoughts of it? Um, Give
Well,
people a preview.
sure. I mean, like I didn't like that much the movie, but like I'll comment in terms of what it's maybe like relevant to what we've been like talking about, and it's just like this is a movie that is not even encrypted in terms of like the occultic, more spiritual aspects or of it, like the magical aspects, and it references like actual occultists and like actual like practices, and that's a little bit what I guess the the way he wanted to make it like a realistic vampire movie, but like so Nosferatu more like a vampire is kind of like this demon figure, and it's like based on like yeah, like actual real occultism now. So I find that really interesting that we're having like this sort of transition from like no spirituality and like being kind of allergic to it in like popular media, and instead of going maybe towards a more like intermediate step, we're going to full occultism, full on esoteric exposition in like mainstream media. So that's gonna be like a really interesting change. Like the rise of all this um, development in culture. Like people are way more interested in things like magic, witchcraft, like Kabbalah. All these things are becoming a lot more popular, I guess, with the free flow of information.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you and I mean, if we were born in the 1970s, we would have to have some crazy person be like, "Hey, have you seen this?" But now I can just, you hear about it, you can go research it, get, Diane Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, then you're red pilled and you're in, it's like no big deal. Um, yeah, it's crazy. And, and I wonder about, it not having that intermediary step, if that's going to be problematic, because if you make that jump and you don't have that, then people are going to just turn it into something ironic or turn it into something that's just silly and not understand. Because as you know, there has to be at some level a base level knowledge or understanding, or it just turns into a symbol. It turns into something that just can be destroyed. because a lot of these symbols, a lot of these things, I mean, this is a really potent opportunity for cinema and film, because and we can talk about literature and uh, uh, those symbols being encrypted in literature, but they're a system. They're like, they build on each other, and it's not just about like divination or these things. It's about, in actuality, the understanding of the archetypes. It's the secret knowledge that we weren't allowed to talk about for 1,000 years, about ourselves, about consciousness. And so, I'm going to be interested to see if, like, how that is managed and how the public reacts.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely it's something that has its dangers. There was a reason why these things were like called, esoteric, or like you had to have like a certain level of maturity to access them in a way that they don't like become like problematic or hurtful, because it is something that has its inherent risks if you like start trying to practice things that are above your like pay grade. And that's why I think, like doing like more poetry and things that do this kind of like encryption, like, but in a way that it also allows you to access and understand it in your own rhythm, right, is so important right now. And instead of just like giving away like just like how to do like ritual invocations of like demons to get wealthy or something like that, like it's just like providing the tools. This was more or less what myth used to represent, like all of mythology. Like even in the past, it was like we think that like the ancients like thought about mythology as if it was like very literal, like and but they had like a similar way of understanding mythology than we have. Like they would analyze it and try to decrypt it into like a more practical terms of what the myth means. We have like conversations with like Socrates and Plato, and they were themselves just analyzing like the Greek myth, right? Like, and what do these things represent? It's not that they like read them like as just like as fantasy stories, right? Like oh, Mars did this with like Venus, oh, how scandalous and stuff like that. No, they had like a way more profound and like hermeneutical understanding of it. So I think that's something that we need to understand, that and as artists and as like also consumers of culture, that to have like a more involved um, understanding of what we're consuming actually.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and there's a lot there, but if you look at the, hermeticism and, the encryption of stuff all throughout culture, it was a big deal. And and Benno and I aren't, I don't know about Benno, but I'm not from the aristocracy. He's probably not either. We weren't given access to this information. And there is an urge, especially at the start, and especially the inner internet anarchists within, to just share everything, get everybody, activated with this stuff. But I've personally experienced and seen, I mean, even in my own life, I've gone too far, went above my pay grade, but I've also seen others have much more disastrous results. I remember like one of the more shocking moments for me was when I taught some guy I knew like all my yoga secrets, right? Like back in the day, I'm just gonna tell everybody. And I showed him all this stuff and like all this, and then he used it to basically manipulate some girl at our martial arts gym who was 16, and it was legal to be his girlfriend. And he was like 34. And I was like, and he was doing all the breathing techniques and the meditations. I was like, Jesus Christ, what did I do? This is terrible. And then obviously they broke up 6 months later, and now she's like screwed up. I'm like, is this my fault? I'm like, it's like, Jesus, like this stuff is wild. And so but then, obviously anyway, so there is a balance between it. And so speaking of encryptions and poetry, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's really where, you can really get crazy with it. But some of the best fiction writers do this too. Could you speak about what, I mean, you and I were in a Blood Meridian book club together. A lot of that's Cormac McCarthy's like a master of this. When you look at like Blood Meridian, there's like stuff just littered in there that's just like, oh my God, like he's and so I mean, here's the question. Why did he do that? Like, is it for you and I to be like 10, 20 years later, like, we found the Easter eggs? Or do you believe that if you put these symbols in there, that the readers unconsciously process it? And like, does that happen? Is that real? Like, even if they don't know anything about it, is there some like structure in our brain that automatically understands that stuff and it perceives it as quality?
Yeah, yeah, I would say that there is like an aspect of like human beings that can like uh, through art, like under like get like at a more deeper level that impact. And it's something that if it's powerful enough, it will drive you to try to like decrypt it, like from something that came from like a more kind of like well, emotional, almost like impact from like how it's written and encoded. And but yeah, like that's what I think it makes art good art and a more effective way to communicating things, because it's capable of transmitting this message in a way that that it leaves it up to the reader to kind of like process for himself, instead of just like giving it out as information. So because that's kind of like the problem, to understand all these aspects just as an intellectual task and information and something that you learn, when it's something that you have to work at yourself, that it involves some form of like earning, right? So like I think in Blood Meridian it's well done. Maybe more on, sometimes more on like the kind of like hermetic side. So but yeah, I think it's a good example of how you can tell like a story that at a plain level might seem like very materialistic, and just like take it for like a really violent like cowboy story. But the more you start analyzing the language and some of the impactful things that are said, or like the riddles, you start you start going down different dimensions of meaning that can reach towards really sophisticated metaphysical underpinnings.
Yeah, I mean, and I really liked what you said there is that, like, yeah, I mean, we can't really prove or like any of like the does it unconsciously activate something, but there for real is a desire, as we've seen, that when people read Blood Meridian, it's the story's pretty straightforward. Maybe the ending is a little bit ambiguous, but it's pretty easy to figure out, okay, this is what happened. But people want to know like more, like people desire to keep researching. Like my channel is somewhat based on that. Like there's this like, and so if your art can do that, if it can make them more, and that's like the key of transformative art is that if it's not just that you read something like, oh my God, my life's changed, you have to work with that information. You have to take that into the world, and that sends you down something, and that's, because there's plenty of readers who are just passive nerds who have experienced no transformation. But, with art and with, and that's when we were talking about theater, that's what's I've perceived as the theater, when you see, and even in cinema, that's sad too. I've been thinking about that like, me watching a movie on my phone or on my laptop screen, there's something different when you go see those movies in person. Like it's insane because I have a vintage movie theater right next to me. So I go watch movies from the 80s and the 90s I've seen 5 times on my phone, but I experience it totally differently with a group. And the same with theater. Like I don't, maybe you do, but I never watch plays on my phone. But when I just don't do that. But I go in person and I watch, and it changes me. And so it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's just um, well, part of what you want with art is to replicate a little bit of the process of growth and understanding of life itself, right? So um, life is difficult. You'll be faced with like a lot of circumstances that will demand to you to change, to learn to see things in a different way, to understand at a deeper level how it works. And so you by present, well, it's kind of like a riddle, and sometimes like you can do that through art and present it in a similar fashion, so that it kind of like makes you want to go through that process of like really understanding what is going on, right? Like, so it's almost like little flight simulators in a way, right? Like that will give you like this experience towards that can help you deepen your understanding, right? Like, and access different ways of viewing things. So that's something that makes it way more powerful than just arguing with people, or just like going into like internet debates where it becomes more of a like yeah, just like playing chess without any real consequences, just like rhetoric, instead of like really trying to change your point of view, not change necessarily the others.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you understand this, and it's just sad to see that like that's what art's turned into, and like it's just like it's endless. It's like, oh my god, and it's like we could be creating something beautiful. There's so many, that same energy could be used to create something beautiful, and Benno and I shit on people all the time. Him and I we've read books together and been like, what the fuck is this? Like this sucks. Like Jesus Christ. Um, they didn't make a clear point in the first three chapters. Like Jesus. And so that's okay too. We don't need to have this toxic positivity movement going on here. But there has to be a integration and push and pull going on with all of this. So I've also wanted to ask you about this for a while. So I'm just going to keep indulging for myself. Can you give us some general thoughts on why 2666 Bolaño, why you like him, why he's influential? I know when you first joined Substack, your name was Archimboldi. I was like, who is this guy? You know, give us general thoughts on him. I've always wanted to hear that from you. So
Okay, yeah, sure. Like, I mean, like, there might be like some very mundane reasons, but like part of it is I read it when I was like also kind of young, I guess, like, and it was very impactful in terms of like shaping my ideas of like literature, and like at least like the Savage Detectives also like takes place where I live in Mexico City, and the like and in the university where I studied. So like there was also like this sense of proximity, right? And but like with Bolaño, I think that uh, I think what makes Bolaño special, and for me, it's that this sense of like really pursuing art to almost like a religious level, right? Like this is like my pathway almost to in as a way to develop as a human being. A lot of the his books like have to do with people who, like, whether it's poetry or novels or like, or just like it becomes like their mission in life, right? And like this level of commitment that you can also see in his own life, right? Like his last 10 years he was just writing like a maniac, like to leave something to his family. So like this level to commitment to the craft is just like very inspiring as a writer myself, so from that point of view, I think he's a great example, and it does also, lead towards in 2066. It might be more pessimistic in terms of, I guess, this literary direction, I guess, but that's more maybe more for a talk specifically about the book itself, because it could go for a long while.
yeah, funny enough, I got a comment I laughed at. They were like, the part about the critics, that was about you. Like saying me on book two. I was like, all right, thank you, man. I was like, that's actually one of the more harsh insults I've ever gotten. Like, actually, thank you. That was actually original. Thank you. Like, just like this guy fucking sucks. Like, no, like that was good. Thank you. Um, anyway, yeah, well, and I agree though that like when I first encountered Bolaño, like there were obviously changes that happened in me from his work, but looking at his commitment to the craft, like, and I heard like him starving and getting sick just to be a writer, and like the whole idea of being an infrarealist, and like they were back in Mexico, they would like at someone's poetry reading, like when like Rupi Kaur or whoever it was at the time would be reading, they would just like storm in and just like ruin the meeting. I'm like, that sounds good. Like, like imagine, man, like people don't like people do that when like, Ben Shapiro's talking or something, or the president. But like, imagine, like, people would be shocked if like Benno and I showed up and we like took over a poetry reading. Like, it'd be, but like that might be what we need to do. Like, stuff like that is like it creates movement. It like uplift, and like, and if you look at the results, I mean, yeah, so there's kind of that, like, I think Benno probably feels the same way. It's, in being in the modern world is weird because like I can't go be Basho. I mean, I can, but I have this pull, and I don't know if it's the structure of our society. I don't know, but like sometimes I want to be like a Tonka truck and just like go destroy and like go be an infrarealist. And so it's, I think it's somewhat liberating to exist between those two polarities, that I could access the Kabbalah and nature, but then I can also like be the great destroyer all at once. It's really cool.
Yeah, yeah, and I think to comment on what you just said, like about maybe wanting to be bachelor, I think the problem is that right now we had like some form of like collapse in terms of like a lot of what we consider art, and what it used to be. Like right now we just have like in terms of culture, we just have like the popular culture, like the mass produced, but we don't have the things that really are more um, profound, that that perhaps before you had like both at the same time. And so in that sense, like for artists right now, it's we have to like almost reconstruct from zero things, which is like both hard but also like a great opportunity in terms of creativity, right? Like we don't necessarily have like the ease of like an uninterrupted tradition, I guess, towards which we can grow, but we can also like decide in which way we want to reconstruct culture. And that's like something that is very special, I think. And it's hard because like we don't really know yet how we're gonna do it, but I think that will be like a rewarding work, and something that like if we step up to it, will be we can bring like a lot of really positive things.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point because I mean, all throughout history, it's interesting because Basho, who was he writing for? He was mostly writing for literate people. I mean, he wasn't writing for anyone, but like the aristocracy, and back in time immemorial, the people who could read, their time and attention, especially at home when they were able to read, before there was music that was, well, I forget what they're called, sonographs, I don't know what it's called, but before, the 1800s, you could only go to the theater or have someone play music for you. So the average literate person, books were the ultimate leisure activity. And, they had some depth to them. And then when you look at like the late 1800s and early 1900s with mass education, a lot of people didn't have radios, televisions, music players yet. And they were literate. We had this mass wave of literate people who could read the Bible and like all this stuff, like hard books. And, and so you could write something profound and deliver it like Walt Whitman. Like Walt Whitman was appreciated. Like you can't, if you write something at that level of, depth in today's term and give it to the average everyday literate person, they're not going to be able to perceive it. And so but like you said, it's an interesting, we have to reconstruct that bridge. We have to bring people from point A to point B. We can't sit and complain and be like, oh, they suck. We have to somehow convince them to come with us, And so we're in a very unique spot right now, which I think is going to be I mean, it's an awesome spot to be in, honestly. Maybe it'd be great to be in the other one. We could just experiment and everyone loves what we do. But like the people that like help you get on, even like maybe Benno and I aren't going to be the goats, but I have more admiration for the authors, like you like maybe like Bolaño, like the authors maybe at the start, when I was 18, 19, who really influenced me. But now I'm like, I don't know if they're my favorite author. I have more appreciation for them than the random dude I read today that I think's really good, And so we could, seemingly we could be serving that gap right now, like really helping people like, in mass get to the next level.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely, and it requires like a transformation of the idea we have of artists, right? Like it has to change from this like narcissistic, hedonistic like rock star into something that it's more resembles more like the high places that poets used to have, like in the bards tradition, like in the druids, and like all these people where the poets were like the ones who almost maintain culture, like through the retelling of the myths, through the creation and like the updating and like the transformation of it. And it used to have like a more of a service role towards society. Like we used to think of artists right now like as some kind of self-serving, like art for art's sake kind of thing, where before like this, like the artist was was just like a job. Like you would go paint your church and like all people would benefit from it, like it was like something very communal and it was like a work. And then you go sculpt this like icon, like it was something that wasn't just art for art's sake. It served a purpose to the community, right? Like it served like even like a spiritual purpose, like. And so regaining the sense of like a purpose as something that has more of a communal aspect to it, that it's more like almost like a job. It's not just, like of course there's like a self-serving or like a something that is of benefit from doing it like individually, and like maybe from person to person that might have different dimensions, but like it needs to have this more um, conscience about how it works in the community and what sort of things it can accomplish, right? Like because otherwise we'll just have like this the same kind of narcissistic competition of artists that really has served its course. Like it ended tragically, like from the confessional poets like Sylvia Plath and all these guys, like almost almost all of them like killed themselves. Like
Yeah.
it's a really bad point to end things in. So like continuing down that tradition will serve no one, like not even the artist itself. Even if you're successful, you would probably just like end up having like this kind of crazy bad life. So we really have to rethink like the position of the artist instead of like this like the like the terrible idea of like the rock star, right? Like just like this hedonistic person into something more communal.
Sorry, that was getting the halo on my head right there. That was that's we need to be of the community. But I 100 I mean, and that's why I'm friends with you, Benno. That's why I believe in you and your work. Like people really need to hear that, because and we have a beautiful opportunity. Like we don't need like we broke away from that tradition, and like we can carry that forward with us. We could we do art for art's sake and have fun. Like there's some pieces I see you release that are just, they're just like you messing around, and it's so fun to watch. And like we don't need to always be serious. It doesn't always need to be this, but that's what I'm sure the people of back in the day were doing the same thing. Like the bars, like they were getting drunk and having fun and like viewing ourselves in that position and taking ourselves more seriously. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Benno. Like I don't think people understand the gravitas of where John Berryman, who's considered like the best confessional poet, dead, suicide. Like there are multiple, if not all of the confessional poets and that was almost the end of poetry as we know it. Because if you look at like John Berryman's dream songs and Plath, like they were basically right before postmodernism took us and just like just turned poetry into whatever the fuck it is. And and they were working with all this stuff and they thought they were at the highest level, but in actuality they just got totally away from everything. Like they just went too deep into in themselves. I mean, and it's somewhat tragic. It's somewhat tragic to look at what happens even with modernism. You look at Pound becoming a fascist. You look at Rilke. Rilke was a deep person, but he was also kind of a piece of shit. Not to say that all the artists in the past were great people, but there were artists and writers, and I would not maybe not most of them, but who were good men and good artists. Who were staples, and and so it's interesting that like we've almost fallen off that cliff. And now here, right conscious at some level is like, it's not built, but like I have lots of successful videos that are basically just like gossip videos about David Foster Wallace beat up a girl, or like Cormac McCarthy got with a 14-year-old. Like it's like Jesus Christ, like we're not better than that yet. Like we're not, like, not to say that everyone needs to be perfect, but it's like, wow, like we've really lost like that standing, and like that, it's sad, and that's why, guys like Mishima are funny, is like, because, you know, any, even guys like Mishima, like he talks about all that, but then you look at his personal life, you're like, wait, is this guy really living this? Yeah, it's
Y-
interesting. And that's maybe something to do with fame and power. Like, I don't know if the bards of old could just instant, like right now, if Benno blew up and like became famous, like the temptations are insane. Like the access to power and what you could do is just like unworldly.
yeah, yeah, and it's also, yeah, like a matter of balance, I guess, in terms of like we understand as like the artistic production. Like the haiku came from like a basically also like a game. It was something that like poets did like as a almost like a poetical word game. So it's not necessarily just about being super serious and like making like always like almost like a very religious art, that's meant to, like it's way more, um it can be way more balanced than that, like even in like, for example, in Nordic myth, which will have like of course very like serious like religious like underpinnings, but there's also just like a bunch of like really silly funny stuff, right? Like, so like bad poetry comes basically from Odin, like flying like in the form of an eagle after stealing like the meat of poetry, and he just farts some of the beat out, and like that's where the Nordic people thought bad poetry came from, right? So there's also like there's a space for all of these manifestations. The problem is when we just concentrate on like very specific unbalanced ways of it, right? Like and I think it's time to like expand a little bit more the capabilities and the possibilities that it can have, like both personally and at a like a social level, right? So yeah, it doesn't have to be like as rigorous, like as being like a monk and just like going on and like learn by memory the Odyssey and just like recite it in a trance, but like certainly we have to start to consider that, like that is a possibility of human experience and of human culture. And it should serve us to like find new avenues to reconnect to those more profound aspects.
100%. Here's a question. You could deflect it David Lynch and Cormac McCarthy style if you want. I don't care. But Ben, you sit down. Where does your poetry come from? Like, how does it? I mean, it seems very inspirational. Um, because just the wide ranging tonality and form of it. But I've never heard you talk about that. If you want to talk about it.
Like, sure, I can do a little bit of it. Like, of course, like part of it like deals with like maybe more complex things to talk about, like what is inspiration and what is these things we are accessing. Like in terms of like haiku, it's very simple. A lot of the times it just comes like from like contemplating nature, like and it's a really interesting thing. Like you start, like in some ways, like I view life almost as a conversation, like between what you're trying to do and then like what life and or like in more like spiritual terms, like the logos, the word, like reality is almost like is structured like as language. So there, like the problem is that most of the time people are too busy to kind of try to listen. But when you're trying to like access more relaxed contemplative states and trying to pay attention, then you'll start to perceive a lot of those things, and like and you can have like really profound experiences just from looking at a tree, like and you'll get like this communication, which is really mysterious. And part of the labor of like the poet or the artist in general is trying to process that and understand it so that you can in turn communicate it back, right? So it's like this back and forth communication that you're having, and the more you go into it, the more fluid it starts to become. So I guess that's a simple way to like state it, at least from one aspect of the poems I do. Some others just come from like reading poetry also, right? Like I'll be reading like Shakespeare or some other poet, and I'll be inspired and like write something off of that. Or sometimes like it can be more intellectual things, and just trying to figure out ways to portray it in a more sensible way, in a more embodied way. So those are some of like the different ways, like I usually go about my work, I guess.
Yeah, and I could 100% tell that, and so I'm somewhat sorry for asking that question, but I think it opens up just a good, because really that's what it is. I think a lot of people, obviously, we could all sit down and intellectualize something, but there's three different, I mean, those are basically the three buckets. You could sit down and say, I'm going to write a poem about this, or like get an idea and like have to work through it, because some of your poetry is very, I could say, it's not complicated, but its structure, its form, its rhythm. Like, okay, Benno sat down and revised this. Like Benno thought about this one. Like this is, but then I go read, Vulcan Snow, and I could tell that's a conversation. Like that's conversing with, because that's how almost all my poetry is. I'm just standing out in nature. I just go sit and I just get a message, and then boom, there it is. And then maybe a little bit of revision to make it sound better. Like that. And that's like speaking of the occult, that's something that people should be engaging with in reality outside of art. That like if you are open and you listen, just in terms of how you treat others and how you view yourself and many aspects of life, like you can get more than you could possibly imagine from whatever that is. I mean, God, the universe, your higher self, who knows? But there is something there that like you have to be silent and like contemplative or just doing nothing to get, but and then obviously there's the inspiration aspect. Then there's like just reading people. And so those, I mean, that's the perfect answer. Like those are like basically the three buckets most of the time where you get stuff. Yeah, I mean, and the more that you're in that mode, the more that you're doing those three things, um, the more then you can become a prolific writer like Benno. Then you could be releasing a lot. I mean, holy crap, man, you're killing the game. I mean, you release a lot of stuff that isn't crap. Like you really, yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. I remember when you were just starting to like start writing, you're like, dude, this schedule is gonna kill me, man. Like releasing a poem, like
Yeah, but it's just there's sometimes it's just like also like seasons, like
yeah,
it's also not something that you can be always entirely in control of, like certainly um like there will be seasons where you might be drawn towards developing all other areas of yourself, right? Like it happens for me, for example, also in terms of like the different mediums I like, right? Like for right now I'm probably going more into music and some more performative aspects, right? But there will be times where I'll be just like writing every day, and like and it'll just flow. There's a balance between effort and also just like rest, because it's not always something you'll be able to kind of like force, even if you want to write every day necessarily, like sometimes it's just a matter also just of like it doesn't have to be always like, as you said, like pertaining towards artistic creation. That's also something important that is needed to balance. Like if you go out into the park and you say, look, I'm gonna write 3 poems, and you're just like looking at everything trying to find inspiration, you almost have to step out of like the artist and the writer, because if you start to look at everything just through the lens of I'm gonna like extract from it like meaning and beauty, like you get into a mindset where you won't get really much at all, right? So this is something that for artists, I guess, but in life in general, you need to like kind of learn to relax and just like contemplate, like, and different people will get different things out of it and will try to manifest it, or like, or not, in different avenues, so yeah, that's also like an important about rhythms in life, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that's seasons have to happen, everybody. Like, if you're a real human being too, like having a writing routine is great and all of that stuff, but especially with more inspirational stuff. Like if you're writing a novel and trying to get a draft done, it's a marathon. So okay, boom, get that done. Like see it through. It's this linear, objective thing. And if you take a month off in the middle, like you may not remember what was actually happening. But like a lot of like for like what really like like what made me into a better poet, maybe I'm not a good poet now, but what changed like my quality from what it was I didn't I just showed up at this. I drove outside of Las Vegas 30 minutes every day to the same spot in nature. And I just sat there, no ambition. I didn't need to write. I'm just going to sit there and look, or maybe listen to music, maybe do yoga. I'm just going to be here every single day, wind, rain, shine, whatever, 110 degrees, doesn't matter. And then suddenly the messages started coming. Suddenly, um, it came to me because I wasn't trying to force it. So like, yeah, like that's, having a space. You don't need to go outside, but having a space, having a route, not a routine, but just existing, then the stuff will come. Like that's like it's like yeah, and that's like the problem with this like optimization culture. And like sometimes I have to push that like on my channel for like novel writers, because like I said, that's a different game. But yeah, in general, and and just speaking of other, I don't think people realize too, just other art forms, like being able to engage in other things, like is going to be good for you. Like we were talking about earlier, like taking an objective point of view toward all this is really dumb, and it's really not going to serve you very well. But it's surprising the amount of people I know who don't do anything else other than write. Like they don't have any other artistic outlet, which is sad. Like you don't need to be rocking on the guitar or releasing songs like Benno, but just there's like 30 different things you could do. At least in terms of art, and like not having any of that, like it's really just keeping you in a very one-dimensional space. Yeah, so
Yeah, and I think it's a really difficult balance to get as writers, I guess, because since like since you work a lot with like words, it's something that kind of like can start like permeating the way you think about life and the way you think about how the things you do. So I think there's like this very common problem of just like start seeing life as something to extract out like writing out of, right?
yeah,
So and that becomes like problem both for you as a person but for you as an artist too, because like you're not going to be able to really um, access like really meaningful things if you're in that kind of mindset. And it's really interesting the like the difference between like thinking about writing and actually writing, because they're both very different. Like when you are writing, you almost need to access like an intermediate spot between like intuition and like thinking, right? Because if you're only thinking, then it's just gonna be something really rational, and it's never really gonna manifest in something that it's alive. It's just gonna be like a bunch of diagrams of plot lines and stuff like that that will never really be meaningful, right? And this is something like I struggled a lot with, just like this balance and understanding between like that thinking about writing is not writing, right? So like and it's something that can be really corruptive towards the way you think about life, your relationships, your activities, right? So it's something that is really important for a writer to learn to master, so that it doesn't become like like a creepy dude that writes about all his like sexual experiences for like, well, you
yeah,
can do it, but like there's people who just go like looking for adventures to write about, which is like leads to kind of like these weird like exploitative relationships, right? Like where like it
yeah,
becomes just like very
yeah.
self-serving way of living life.
Yeah, and you don't want to fall into that. Like, you don't want to be another suffering artist just exploiting people. And funny enough, it was the opposite for me. So when I was my most rational, lost in words, I remember I went to some party. I got invited out for the first time in like 6 months. I'm going to this party, and not sober. And the first girl, a woman I start talking to seems interested in me. And I like ask a great question, and like she's talking, and then it's time for me to talk. And then what I'm like, you've used the plural when you were supposed to use the singular 3 times. And she goes, "What? Are you okay?" This is like at 1 in the morning on a Saturday night. And I'm like, "Oh my God." And it just totally ruined it all. And then I went home, I was like, I need to change. I was like, Rilke, I need to change my life. Like, Jesus Christ. Like, like, and that's real though. Like, when you
Mhm.
get lost in words, you can also like just, when you see everything, like you can become like lost in words. And like, that's a disaster too. And like, you, and like I was saying, like you can do that, but do you want to be like the people in history who have done that? Do you want to be that person? Like if I kept going down that trajectory, like Jesus Christ, man, like
Yeah, it's not worth it. Like it's not worth sacrificing your life for art. You know, art should serve you towards life and living like a growing life. Like if you if you like instead like try to there has to be like some form of balance. Like sometimes it does demand sacrifice and effort. But like it shouldn't also become something you're like sacrificing, or like maybe um well, it just gets into like a more individual, like really be clear about what your intentions are and why you're doing art. Like it, because it's really easy to get corrupted towards expecting things out of art that are not necessarily positive. Like wanting fame, recognition, like using it as a way for people to love you. Like all these kind of things that are very common for artists. Because usually tend to be more of the outcast type. So like you start using it like as a towards other purposes that might not be like really good for you, and probably for your art also. So it's very important to also like be clear about what your intentions are.
yeah, 100%. All right, Benno. Well, we'll end it there on a very happy and positive note. All right, Benno is over at Stranger Strands, everyone, over on Substack. Link down in the description below. Just go click on something random over there. I dare you. Like, just go scroll and click on something random and see what happens. And you're going to be like, what? And then just keep going. Like, for sure, Benno is a literary crusader, one of my favorite people to see show up in my email inbox. And so, Benno, do you have any closing words for the people?
Well, it's been a great talk. I'm really happy we had this conversation, and yeah, like I'll see you guys there. Like I'm always open towards discussions, collaboration. So like jump in. We are building like a really cool community.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll post some of the crazy collaborations Benno has done down below too. So, all right, peace out, everybody. See ya.